Senate Chamber.
Mm-hmm. It's up in Kelly's on today. He'll be ducking and diving.
Okay, thank you, members, and we're now resuming at agenda item 8, and this is a briefing from the National Deaf Children's Society, an evidence session on the Sign Language Bill. So, papers for the agenda item start at page 632 of your pack, members, and I'd now like to welcome the following representatives to the meeting. So we have Deirdre Vaughan, who is Government Relations Advisor, and Jacqueline Melville, who is Head of Policy and Influencing here in the North. So you're very, very welcome. And Deirdre, I understand you will make a brief opening statement before handing over to Jacqueline, and then we'll go to questions from members, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair and members of the committee. Just to start off by saying, on behalf of the National Deaf Children's Society, NDCS, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to provide evidence today. Just to let you know, Jacqueline and I are both hearing, and we work as part of a wider staff team of hearing and deaf colleagues, as well as colleagues who are children of deaf adults and parents of deaf children. First of all, we wish to extend a warm welcome to the introduction of the sign language, which offers a meaningful opportunity in this mandate to achieve lasting positive change for deaf children, their families, both now and in the future. The introduction of the bill marks an important milestone, not just for deaf children, families and the wider deaf community, but also, we believe, for us as a society striving to better embed equality and respect in our laws, policies, public services and everyday lives. The bill is long overdue, but most definitely to be welcomed. By way of introduction to National Deaf Children's Society, we are dedicated to supporting deaf children and young people, as well as their families. Across Northern Ireland, we work with and alongside a diverse population of deaf children, and we support all deaf children and families, regardless of level or type of deafness or mode of communication they choose to use. All of our work is guided by the principle of informed choice. That is, making sure deaf children and families have access to unbiased information and support to make the decisions that are right for them, and this includes promoting access to sign language as a key option. We would like to acknowledge the ongoing work of the Department on sign language and also for consulting and involving a range of organisations on this. Our evidence today has been directly informed by our ongoing work with deaf children and families, as well as our consultations on sign language in 2016, 2021 and our recent 2025 survey. So I'll now hand over to Jacqueline, who will highlight the key themes that members may wish to consider during committee stage. Thank you.
So the bill is ambitious in many areas, and we particularly welcome commitments to ensuring access to sign language classes for deaf children and families, access to information and services in sign language, accreditation of tutors and interpreters, and duties to promote sign language. These provisions can make a significant and important difference in the lives of many deaf children and families who use or wish to use sign language. But it is perhaps unsurprising that at NDCS there are areas where we would like to see the ambition of the bill to be extended further, or where we are seeking clarification to make sure that the bill will deliver for deaf children. Deaf children are not a homogenous group. Each child, their experience of deafness, their wider circumstances and needs is unique, and their journey with sign language will be individual. This is important when considering how the bill may work in practice, and there are 3 areas we would like to highlight. Firstly, inclusion. So deaf children's relationship with sign language can develop and change over time, and the bill's provision should be available to deaf children regardless of age, of level or type of deafness, or the point they are at in their sign language journey. The bill uses different phrasing at times in regard to sign language, such as where its use is necessary or convenient, or where an individual relies on sign language. The strongest and most poignant theme from our recent survey was the potential of the bill to progress inclusion, equality and respect for all deaf children who use sign language. The phrasing in the bill should not inadvertently or unintentionally restrict the group of deaf children and families that can benefit from its entitlements. To ensure this, there should be a clear and consistent definition that recognises the evolving relationship deaf children may have with sign language. Our second area is impact. To create meaningful change, the bill must extend across deaf children and young people's lives. This means ensuring that the range of prescribed organisations in the bill genuinely reflects the settings that are important to children and families. Again, our engagement has underlined that settings across early years, education, play and recreation, as well as areas like family support, health and social care, public transport, employment support and justice should be addressed. Thinking about the broader policy framework for children, the Children's Strategy and the Children's Services Cooperation Act define clear outcome areas for children's wellbeing across all areas of their lives. These outcome areas could provide a useful basis through which the bill's list of prescribed bodies, as well as the sign language plans prescribed bodies will be required to develop, could be framed. And our third area is implementation. The bill's implementation must be robust. We are mindful that much of the detail of the bill will come through regulations and guidance, and a clear time frame for these should be in place, and the process around them should allow for proper consultation. This should of course include Assembly scrutiny, but also consultation with deaf children and families. We note concern in the bill that the department can consult only at least one person or group, appearing to the department to be acting on behalf of the deaf community in relation to both regulations and guidance. And the language used in the bill should not inadvertently restrict consultation with deaf children and young people. Deaf children and families' views should also inform reporting on the bill. Reporting should have a clear focus on reviewing the effectiveness of the legislation and guidance and identifying recommendations for improvement. An interim report being completed before the 5-yearly reporting cycle begins would be welcome. Lastly on this, effective implementation will require awareness raising about the bill and its duties as well as resourcing. Finally, we would like to invite the committee to meet with some of the deaf children and families we have the privilege to work alongside. But for now, we'd like to thank you for your time this morning, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay. Thank you. And that is really, really useful, and your written submission is very useful as well. So your written submission does state that 36% of deaf children have been identified as having additional special educational need, and the deaf children here in the north have a higher prevalence of mental health concerns than their peers. So this means that children and their families will be navigating interaction with multiple agencies on an ongoing basis and multiple support services. Clause 3 of the bill states that every prescribed organisation must take reasonable steps to ensure their information and services are equally accessible. And you note the need for a high threshold in relation to that. Can you talk a little bit about what that high threshold might mean in practice and how it might be reflected in the bill?
And you've touched exactly on one of the key points, and that's about taking a step back almost and thinking about the arrangements that need to be in place to support good implementation from the bill. So it's thinking about the diversity and the complexity and the richness of the population when we're looking at deaf children and families across Northern Ireland, and making sure two things are in place. Firstly, robust routes to identification of deafness, and understanding that currently the majority of children, deafness is not identified through the newborn hearing screening programme. It might be through that route, but the majority of children are older. They may be compulsory school age before deafness occurs or is identified. So having strong identification in place, and then following from that, having services wrap around children and families holistically. So there's a strong pathway that links in with their tailored support for their individual needs, which can pick up on additional special educational needs, pick up on mental health needs, as well as embedding that access to informed choice that Deirdre's touched on, and making sure that children and families have that unbiased information and evidence to make the choices that are right for them, and that sign language needs to be a part of that. In terms of reasonable steps, we appreciate the enabling approach being taken in the bill, and that detail will flow through from regulations and flow through into best practice guidance and the statutory guidance. But it's important that the threshold that's aimed for is high. It's not about minimum standards, it's about what should be done to meet children's and families' needs. Deirdre, you might want to come in a bit more on that.
Just to say that, well, I think that's covered the question, but I would just add that consultation with the deaf community and that wide berth of children maybe with representatives with mild, moderate hearing loss, which is the majority of deaf children in Northern Ireland, they need to be included in any consultation around the high threshold.
Thank you. I see also from your website the Scottish Government has responded positively to proposed amendments to recognise British Sign Language in its new education legislation, and that's thanks in part to 400 deaf children and young people writing to the Scottish Parliament's Education Committee. And I think we have seen some great examples here recently, both in this committee and the PAC on which I sit, of young people here engaging on the development of legislation. And the value they can bring to that. So do you have any other, and I certainly think we will want to consider that what you mentioned there about engaging with some of the young children you represent. I think that would be a great opportunity for us. But do you have any other positive examples of engaging with children, engaging with legislative development that you can share today?
Our colleagues who focus their work in Scotland are absolutely delighted with the developments and the recognition in the legislation in Scotland, and it does provide a really powerful example of how the views and experiences and the needs of children and their families should be shaping legislation. We would want to acknowledge the Department's ongoing dialogue and engagement with a wide range of organisations and bodies across deaf children and families and the wider deaf community, and we want to see that continue. It's important that the bill, as we've mentioned, doesn't almost inadvertently restrict that good practice that is developing. Children and families' experiences need to be at the heart of the development of the bill, and right through regulations, the development of guidance, and then further through to the reporting on how effective the legislation is. We have really valuable insights from children and families through our consultation about what they would like to see the bill deliver, what it's important for them. Part of that possibly speaks to promotion of sign language. One of the consistent themes from children and from parents has been the potential role of education and work in early years in education to bring sign language into the curriculum more, and that to not just be a vehicle to increase use of sign language, but to increase acceptance, understanding, inclusion, improved deaf awareness in society. We're not where we should be on that for deaf children and their families in Northern Ireland, so the bill, while it obviously has a focus on linguistic rights and sign language, also offers the potential to move us on much more for deaf children.
And if I could just add to that as well, all our evidence today is informed by our own consultation with deaf children and their families, and they are really excited about the promise that's being brought forward in this bill. For example, if you look at workforce as well and building of the bank of tutors, interpreters, they're talking to us about how, a great opportunity for deaf people to become involved and becoming tutors and to bring that really invaluable lived experience. So there's a range of opportunities there for deaf children going forward.
Please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. Just when you were speaking there about sign language in the curriculum, I agree that would be a fantastic way to spread a wider knowledge of sign language, of using sign language. Children are sponges, so they will love seeing something practical and physical that they can do. But it has been raised with me in another evidence session that if we bring sign language into the curriculum, that is not the only thing that schools should do, because a child who uses sign language is probably more proficient than the rest of the people in the class because they're only starting to learn. What can we do? It's about this thing about deaf school and mainstream school. Has there been any comment from any of the children about a preference for being in mainstream or having deaf school, or, you know, how do we take that forward to achieve the best possible outcomes for those young people?
And I think we would come back to informed choice again. It's about ensuring that children and families have access to a wide range of options and are able to make the appropriate choice that is right for them. Wherever deaf children are in our education system, it's absolutely vital that their right to education should be being supported by tailored support based on their individual needs. Just for information, in Northern Ireland, over 3/4 of deaf children are in mainstream settings in education. Around 21% are in special schools, and then smaller numbers of deaf children will be in schools that have a resource provision, a dedicated resource provision attached to the school, or in the one specialist school that we have for deaf children and visually impaired children in Northern Ireland. But the potential to find ways and to build on the positive momentum of the bill to achieve progress in a wide range of settings. Education is such a clear example where that momentum and those opportunities should be taken to promote inclusion is really important.
And when we talk about taking the opportunities for inclusion, in clause 5, it talks about the prescribed organisations must have regard to guidance. Do you think that's strong enough?
I think that's a good example. We're strengthening, potentially, or considering strengthening legislation in the bill might be helpful to ensure that there's due regard to guidance. It is statutory guidance. We want to see guidance of high quality, informed by the experiences of deaf children and young people. But again, we're back to setting that high threshold for prescribed organisations to meet across all areas of children's lives.
And on that, a timetable. The bill can go through as an act and it sits on the statute books, but until a lot of the regulations are brought forward, it won't do anything. I'm very aware, if we go into a consultation with the deaf community, that it needs time to make sure that the regulations will not be a done deal, because they'll be organic, but that the regulations at least have some sort of strength. Should we be pushing for some sort of a time scale for regulations, or is it better not to do that because of the consultation needs?
And I think that's where there is a balance to be struck between being pragmatic and ensuring the bill is delivered and ensuring it's directly informed by the experiences and the expertise and insights of those who it will most affect. What we would say is that our first consultation on this, like many others, was in 2016 with deaf children. They are no longer children. That is nearly a decade ago. Deirdre's touched on the excitement, the sense of hope and pride there is for children and families that will come with the legislation. We would like to see it delivered for deaf children and families in this mandate, where there is the momentum, there is strong executive support from all parties. We don't want deaf children and families to have to wait longer.
I'm just thinking about in clause 6, clause 6.2, it talks about advice as to best practice as set out in guidance by virtue of this section may include. Now, I'm a great believer in no, you do. There's a baseline that you do have to include. What's listed there is not bad. It's not everything, but it's not bad as a start. Do you think that there should be a baseline, that even before we go into the consultation with the deaf community, instead of offer or facilitate, you must provide, you know, as an outcome of this bill, sign language communication in British and Irish? You know, did you think there is a baseline that we should start from? We could get that going, because I'm just a little bit concerned there's too many mays and mights and, you know, could instead of must and shall.
Yes, and I think as well for us and our focus on deaf children and families, that's where we think it might be helpful to explore ways to embed the bill or the regulations or the guidance a little bit more in the wider policy framework for children and young people, and that then addresses some of the concerns that the prescribed organisations may be too narrow in focus. They may not be in the settings that are important to deaf children and their families, or where the guidance may not fully address all the areas that are important to children and families. Again, this is about us wanting to ensure that the bill will deliver meaningful change in children's daily lives.
My final one is again back to this thing on promotion and how we get that out. I watched very closely when health and safety legislation was brought in across Northern Ireland. There was a very determined way that was promoted through Northern Ireland so that all employers would know. Promotion of sign language, to be honest, if we take the same route as that, we can actually have a holistic, cross-executive, cross-departmental promotion of sign language. It's not just if you need it on request, it's a natural part of work. Do you think then that there should be a little bit more in the promotion section just to outline guidance of how that will be done, or when that promotion will happen on a regular basis, hopefully?
I think whether it sits on the face of the bill or it comes through regulations or guidance, probably the committee, the assembly, is better placed to judge that than us. Our main concern is that it is there and that the opportunity to give further definition and clarity to promotion is taken. We've talked about education, we've talked about raise deaf awareness initiatives. It's also making sure that prescribed bodies are aware of their duties, that the wider deaf community is aware of the obligations that prescribed bodies should be meeting on their behalf. And there's important learning from other jurisdictions that have legislation in place. So, for example, in Ireland, there were around, I think, 30% of designated bodies weren't aware of the legislation and their new duties. So it's important that we get to a point where when the bill is ready and becomes live legislation, that all the building blocks are in place so that children and families start to see the difference, the positive difference translated into their lives.
I mean, if I could just sort of say as well about promotion, and I'm just circling back always to the consultations we've had with the deaf community, like promotion equals inclusion. And one of the key themes, the most poignant theme, was the need to reduce that sense within, deaf children's sense of isolation, difference, promote equality and inclusion. And this promotion piece, if you're thinking about it within the school context, yes, it's a greater use of sign language in schools at all levels of the curriculum, but also deaf awareness. I mean, the dream would be that a child would go in and there would be, it wouldn't just be their immediate circle that would know sign language. It would be, their teacher, their classroom assistant, the dinner lady, might have a bit of sign language. So, I mean, all those sort of promotion duties within school, that break down those barriers. So it is crucially important, and it was a key thing that keeps on emerging.
And when we asked in our recent survey on the bill and the positive change, there was, of course, support for access to sign language interpreters, access to information in sign language. But the changes that attracted greatest support, particularly from parents, were staff being able to use sign language and other children being able to use sign language.
Morris?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. I'm along follow the same lines as Kelly in education. That I think that it should be, especially at primary school level, there should be an understanding of sign language which promotes inclusion, it promotes social acceptance, that people have a difference and here's how you deal with it. It would also, I think, promote the development of children who are deaf if they could communicate with their peers in a classroom setting, in a playground setting for having fun, and also the teachers, etc. So, along Kelly's lines there, how do you get that message across that the children need to be educated from primary school level to use and to understand not just deaf children but children who have no hearing difficulties, so they can communicate, and it breaks down barriers, as you've already said, that children do it naturally, become friends with anybody and everybody, and it would help communicate and maybe build friendships and break down those social barriers. and who knows where it can lead to in later life.
You know, and it's that piece about, yeah, as you say, it's inclusion, it's about promotion. When you think, Jacqueline has already said, like 3/4 of deaf children in mainstream settings, they may be the only deaf child in that school. So already baked in is a kind of a sense of difference. So if we're speaking to that, if we're including sign language maybe in the curriculum, you know, at an early level, deaf awareness even, you know, and an awareness of sign language for the whole school, you know, that's at the very early level, you know, that speaks to that, and that will, as you say, break down the barriers, and that can be built on in, you know, in at secondary school. You know, we would be working, you know, for the introduction of a sign language GCSE as well. So, you know, there's lots of things that you can build on, but yes, I think you're right when you mention at an early level, it is so important.
Just my granddaughter's learning Spanish and Mandarin at her primary school, and her teacher explained it to me simply that when she graduates to the next level of schooling, she'll already have a head start.
Yep.
And if you're learning sign language at primary school, you have a head start. Thank you, Chair.
Russ? Brian?
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in the definition of the deaf community. I don't know if you have the wording of the bill in front of me, clause 11. So the deaf community seems to be described as anyone basically who uses sign language for the purpose of the bills, whether that's they themselves are deaf or a family member is deaf. So it can include people who have full hearing. And just how that ties in with in clause 2, where it talks about the availability of classes, and it says that the department should ensure the availability of classes for deaf children, which I presume means a child who is deaf doesn't have full hearing, and just whether the definition there is sufficient, and whether it should include the children of whose parents are deaf or use sign language. Because my reading of that then would mean that the provision of classes wouldn't apply to children born to parents who use sign language. It just seems to be the only, in that clause 2, paragraph 2, seems to be the only place where it talks about deaf children rather than members of the deaf community, which in 11 is described as basically, it seems, my reading of it is anyone who uses sign language is a member of the deaf community. Yeah, and so I'm just thinking it doesn't provide for, as I say, hearing children whose parents are deaf, but they should be provided, of course they would learn from their parent, but there should be the provision of classes from them.
Yes, and I'm not sure, I think we read clause 11 as being inclusive of children, of deaf people, so that would include that category of children who are children of deaf adults. CODA would be the shortened term. I think one thing that's important to recognise about the bill is that it is ambitious, and this is one of the areas where it is ambitious. It's seeking to be inclusive. Where members of the deaf community are defined in clause 11, to us that's very much for the purpose of the bill as a sign language bill. We really welcome the specific focus, and it's one of the areas where there's a clearly defined entitlement, if you like, that flows from the bill, and that is for deaf children and their families to be able to access sign language classes. And that piece around acquisition of sign language, opportunity to learn, availability of classes is absolutely key. We're really mindful that this was touched on in the earlier session, and I think for us as both hearing in our roles, we're always wanting to remember that there's quite a difficult history around sign language, where sign language has been undermined, it has been marginalised, where advice has been given to families to discourage learning sign language, where there's been a really poor understanding that sign language is a valid part of that language-rich environment that all children need. That history is changing. There's good progress, but it is not so long ago that we don't work with parents who have children who are still school age who remember being discouraged at the point of deafness being identified from learning sign language. So it's really important that acquisition piece for children is in, to let them have access to sign language. And that brings us back to the pathways needing to be in place so that children and families, when deafness is identified, are being routed through to that holistic, tailored support that includes, as part of that pathway, being given clear information about communication options, including sign language, and then being able to access classes. I'm not sure if I entirely answered your question there, sorry.
Well, it's something we'll check with officials in due course. I just, most of the bill talks about members of the deaf community, and then it's just in that 2.2b, it talks about for deaf children, their close families, guardians, and I think children of a deaf adult should also be entitled to the free classes, and that could be something that needs to be clarified. I mentioned the last witness who was in, a previous witness had highlighted about sometimes the discouragement, I think that's what you were talking about there, of learning of sign language. And that previous witness said that, I don't know, is there a form of wording that should be included actually in legislation almost to prohibit is that too strong a wording to take, but to prohibit, the intention would be to prohibit the discouragement of the learning of sign language for a deaf child, as sometimes happen where the deciding either from health professionals or from the parents is, oh, we want to try and encourage the child to speak more and learn lip read and use whatever implants can help with if there's limited hearing. But previous witnesses were saying this becomes actually language deprivation, and that actually all forms of communication help to develop communication skills. So there should be a prevention of the discouragement of the learning of sign language.
I think for us at NDCS, we would come back to informed choice. So that's at the heart of everything we do and in all our work with children, young people and families. And it's about the importance of children and families being able to have meaningful choice, clear, unbiased information, meaningful choice, and then access to that infrastructure to support them and the professionals as part of that around the communication mode and language that is right for them. We would be mindful that that changes, evolves. We've touched on that already, and it's really important that that's in line with children's wishes as they grow and develop. It's also important when we're thinking of families that we work with to recognise that for some families use of sign and spoken language is important. For some children, their needs as well as their wishes will change over time. That might be because of, for example, progressive deafness. It might be because there are certain listening environments where sign language is much more appropriate and supportive to them. It might be because their deaf identity as a young person is growing and their connection to the deaf community, deaf culture is increasingly important to them. So for us, it's more making sure that the language in the bill supports that choice, that there's a recognition in the bill that a child and family's relationship with sign language may be evolving, and that there's not any risk of interpretation or implementation of the bill being restrictive and making assumptions that, for example, a child in a family should have made a decision by the time they reach first year of compulsory school, when we know that the majority of children referred to the Education Authority Sensory Service are already school age at that stage.
Okay, no, I hear what you're saying on that. Can I ask one other question, Chair, for time? I wanted to ask about schooling, and you give statistics there, 3/4 of deaf children, is that are in mainstream schools, 21% are in special schools, such as Jordanstown, is that right? Is that still one of the...
Jordanstown we would describe as the specialist school for deaf children and visually impaired children in Northern Ireland.
So, can you, in terms of 3/4 who are in mainstream schools, can you tell us more about how that is enabled? Are these children who might have partial hearing, or can it be children who are fully deaf? How does that work in practice?
It can be a mix. So again, we would want to see individual choice, being able to drive and inform that work around school choice and school placement, that the needs of the child will be catered for individually within each school, and that I suppose particularly thinking about mainstream schools and special schools, the Education Authority Sensory Service I mentioned earlier will have been with those children from birth or from the earliest point of identification, supporting families, and part of their role is to ensure there's tailored support for the child and the family, that progress is being achieved, but they also have a role in advising and supporting mainstream and special school settings to make sure staff have the training, the equipment, the general ongoing advice that they need to be doing whatever is necessary to ensure that each deaf child can fully participate in their education, and also the wider aspects of school. So it's not just classroom time, it's also about lunchtime, it's about extracurricular activities, and again that was a theme that came out in our engagement with children and families.
Yeah, there's a direct quote in the most recent survey we've carried out from a parent saying that their child was excluded from taking part in extracurricular activities just because the child was not able to communicate, and that's where we see the bill has an opportunity to sort of speak to those needs as well.
And are there children who have use sign language in mainstream schools who are using sign language then and have interpreters constantly?
Yeah. There's at the moment we have some data from a CRIDE report which is referenced in our evidence. At the moment 1% of deaf children mainly use sign language in education. 2% use spoken English with signed support. So it's small numbers at present.
But they would have while all their time at school they have someone who can interpret for them. Is that how that works? Or they might be using... in practice, how does that work?
In practice, it will really depend on the individual child. But yes, the point you're making about access to that specialist workforce, if you like, who have sign language skills, who have the appropriate level of sign language to support a child, whether they're in an early year setting or a child whether they're in an exam year, is really important. We think that's one of the reasons the legislation speaking to accreditation of tutors and interpreters is also a very progressive area. We're mindful of the work the department has done and continues to do on building the infrastructure so that not just families and children have access to learning family sign language, but also supporting access for tutors and interpreters to progress. That will need to keep being developed and built over time as part of the implementation.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian. Ellie, you were looking on again.
I was just going to come back to that clause 11. The definition of the deaf community, is there a better one than that? Because it really is quite convoluted what has already been included in the bill. Is there anything that's a bit simpler that's used elsewhere?
Oh, that's a good question. In terms of the detail in that clause, I think for us that is about the department wanting to seek to be inclusive, and that's obviously important. It's maybe something if we go away and look at and
I look at it, for instance, and I would be excluded from it, and I'm deaf, so I have moderate hearing loss, and I'm not included in the deaf community in that. So it talks about children, individuals who rely on British Sign Language, deaf or deafblind people who normally use British Sign Language. It doesn't talk about adults who have acquired hearing loss and, double hearing aid wearers. I just think there must be somewhere there's a better definition.
Yeah, and it goes back to that inclusion piece. You're right entirely. It needs to be recognised that deaf children, deaf people's relationship with sign language can evolve over time. You know, most children in Northern Ireland, as I referenced earlier, have mild to moderate hearing loss. They may not need sign language at the start of their journey, but that may change through choice or through, you know, deterioration of hearing, whatever. So that needs to be spoken to. And I think that you're right in terms of there's a bit of inconsistency in the language throughout the bill. So I think some phrase that says necessary or convenient, or relies on. You know, when necessary and convenient maybe is stronger, possibly, but it would be better if that was consistent throughout the legislation, probably.
If there is another definition, if from your own organisation, it would be really helpful to see that.
It's almost like, Chair, it's like a definition of the sign language community, perhaps effectively, and I know it's a sign language bill, but yeah, at times it feels it clashes with other definitions then.
Yeah.
We could also take some advice from our own bill office around the language and the meanings and options around some of that language, the may, must, the plural of communities. In fact, I note within your submission around the culture of deaf children, and I'm sure deaf children are actually at the driving force of creating that. And it's probably like many other things where there are cultures, there's not even one, and that's to be inclusive as possible. So I think we maybe should take a wee look and just take some further advice on how that might be better reflected. Okay, thank you. That's been a really interesting session. Well, I have to say one of the things, and it would have been one of my questions, was around the 5-year reporting, and we have heard from some of the other evidence sessions that it takes a period of time to establish what's exactly happened, but I think the concept of an interim report is a very useful addition to that consideration, because obviously you want to adjust the tiller if necessary at the earliest possible stage as well. So that's a big problem.
Totally, like we don't have a problem with the 5-year because obviously it gathers data over that period of time, which will be very valuable. But there's no harm in an interim report just to pick up, as you say, any issues or whatever, any problems at an early stage so they can be addressed. So we think that would be a good idea.
Thank you. And the other thing I was very conscious of as you were talking around was the whole that issue of inclusion and the concept of you need to see it to be it. And I was reflecting actually on, and the committee had raised several times around the BBC's decision to remove signing from their midday news. I think it was a really poor decision, I have to say, because it was one opportunity where people saw a sign being used in a mainstream setting. I have to say, I often would have found I would have watched the bulletin again because, first of all, it was more interesting with sign, and I suppose you were hoping to pick up a wee bit of sign or whatever, but it just was an occasion in the day, and the idea that it's all now sort of late at night and in the bottom of the screen and all of that, I think it was a poor step, and we did as a committee raise that, but it's poignant today in relation to the discussion that we're having. So thank you very much. We will be in touch with you around some of the things that have been discussed, and appreciate your written submission and your evidence here today. It's been really useful and a really, really important perspective to include children specifically as a voice, and I think that's really the committee really do appreciate that. So thank you. Thank you. Okay, members, so any follow-up actions then, members?
Can we just get agreement?
Would members agree that we seek some advice from the Bills Office around the language and how we might...
Yes. On the definition of the deaf community? Or
on a number of, that for one, and I think that's a valuable point to raise, but around some of the other, just a singular of community and things like that. See, and the consistency maybe as well.
Yeah, and well, if we can raise that with them, I just feel, as I've asked both the two to be there about who gets the classes. I just feel there's more work needed on that, and that point about, it's entirely about individual choice, respecting that. But a few have pointed this idea of a discouragement, of the learning of sign language, and just strengthening up the idea that it should never be discouraged. It should always be promoted. And that issue of children of a deaf adult, which my reading of that means they're not entitled to classes, which they should be.
Pardon, clarification, Kelly, were you looking to?
Yeah, I was going to say, can I get clarification on 7.3a? And it goes on then later on, 7.4b. It's this, that the regulations under this chapter may confer functions on the prescribed organisations apart from the Northern Ireland departments, but they are the prescribed organisations. And then it goes on to say regulations may limit the operation of this part in relation to particular prescribed organisations except the Northern Ireland departments. Does that mean then the Northern Ireland departments set their own policies and procedures, or am I reading that wrong? It'd just be useful for a legal mind that knows bills just to clarify what their understanding of it is, because to be quite frank, this is the sign language bill. Doesn't matter what department takes it through, it's a law of the land. There should be a way that the sponsoring department can confer rules and regulations on other departments.
Yeah, would members be content we seek clarity on that? Yeah, and members are content on the other issue.
Chair, I'm just going to say that we will be, before the summer recess, providing a summary report to members on the evidence that's been gathered to date and the sort of main objective points, and that might be the time where we then communicate with the department around seeking some of those clarifications as a group, rather than doing maybe week by week, if members would be content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, members content?
Okay. Just on that, I was going to ask, how many sort of mainstream organisations are there? We've heard from about, I don't know, 4 or 5 now, with representing the interests of the deaf community. Are there more to come before us then?
Going on to
looking across to my colleague over in the corner there.
Right, there's quite a few. Aye. Look, it's just relevant. I mean, we've raised it a few times. The paragraph about at least one person or group, seem to be acting on behalf of the deaf community, and there's quite a number, and that's one of the issues I think we will be wanting to raise, a better way of ensuring any further changes, that there's appropriate consultation with the deaf community.
Thanks, Chair. Just to say as well that part of the purpose of the report towards the end of this session is also to seek thoughts on members on perhaps gaps in the evidence session so far, where that, whether there are other organisations, employers, education establishments and so on that we should be reaching out to and take on board the suggestions around engagement with youth and so on. But we will summarise some thoughts for members to take a view on, so that when you return in September time, there will be those thoughts will have been, hopefully we'll have been able to put some flesh on those bones and move the evidence sessions on.
That?
Yes, and I mean, more what they're saying about key sectors too. At some stage I'd be interested to hear, what are those key sectors? I mean, health, education, justice. Some of the ones. What is currently provided? And I am interested to know the practical workings of it. What is provided. I'd like to think some of the departments would have sufficient demand that they would have interpreters, available across their provision. Others would just bring it in as when it's needed. Like if a deaf parent was coming to a school and wanted to, talk to a principal or a teacher, the provision might be brought in. But others, you'd have thought, would have sufficient demand that they would actually employ interpreters, like the Department for Health, the sort of across their state, just to get an idea of the practical level of provision.
Are you content we put some thoughts on that, Chair, into that report, exactly on those sectoral issues as well?
Kelly,
I was just going to say there are disability champions in each department, and they might be able to highlight what the department does. But I'm just thinking, as Brian has said there, like for instance in individual schools or A&E departments, that's a wider, because it talks in the bill about those that are in providing services of a public character, which is very wide fitting, but doesn't necessarily include domiciliary care services that are provided by a private organisation. So but as far, I think we could ask the disability champions in each department what is currently available that they know of, and then if we need to go beyond that again, it would probably be the Education Authority, the Housing Executive, the Health Trusts, those are ALBs.
Sorry, lastly, just to say, and hopefully with the report will be put together in such a way that members can take a view as to whether it should be forwarded to the department to serve as a prompt on some of the issues that have been raised and so on, to see what their considerations may be, and then the department could perhaps feed back in later on in the calendar year on that report.
We'll go through a report before summer recess, but it's just us, it's not with the department. That would be for later. Okay, fair enough, yeah.
I suppose it's trying to get the balance right between enabling legislation and legislation that actually means something. If it's just enabling legislation and all the regulations are going to follow in due course, you know, it might feel like, well, nothing much has changed.
Yeah.
You know, so I want to have an idea, you know, well, what does this mean in practice, and what are our expectations? What's the community's expectations?
What will people see as a notable improvement?
Yes.
How will things change?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Improve.
Yeah. Improve is right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Listen. Thank you for that, members. Two very good evidence sessions there. I think two good perspectives and very helpful to our consideration. So moving on to agenda item. I'm just checking, Clerk, can we move now to 9? There was a need for a final short
Yes,
suspension.
could we just move to final?
So we need a final short suspension just to get the everything back on track. So are we coming out broadcasting?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Clerk.
Senate Chamber. Sound.